Yeah, thanks Petra. Petra's given away a bit of my age, but a bit of how long we've actually had to be campaigning against the Labor Party policies that were introduced in 1992 in mandatory detention. And I wanted to start out by saying that we gather here today, we need to remember all the people who are dotted in the detention centres around the place. To Mohammed, who's been in the high security annex at Villawood for 6 months. For the people who've been protesting in North 1 and South 2 in Darwin. For the people who are in Red 1 in Christmas Island. For the people who've been on hunger strike and other protests in Curtin. The government may have made an announcement and they may have jibbed from the vote about the Malaysia agreement a couple of days ago, but not one thing has changed for anyone who is presently sitting in detention, and we're here today to make sure that things do change, for the people, for the thousands who are still in detention. There were 40-odd people who were faced with adverse security. To the things that have been mentioned before, to the Indonesian children and the crew that have been unjustly charged with people smuggling. All these things there are so much part of unfinished business that we've got with the Gillard government. We live, I think, at a very strange time as far as the refugee campaign, but in its own way, it's actually more important now than it ever has been. We had something of a turning point in the last week. Bizarrely, and it is truly bizarre, that on the one hand, Julia Gillard could have allowed Tony Abbott to pose as some kind of humanitarian alternative. It is simply bizarre that they should have allowed him to adopt that kind of position and talk about refugees and human rights as if those two things have ever come out of the Liberal Party's mouth in any meaningful sense. But we are also faced, I think, with a particular kind of threat. Because although third country processing was stopped, suspended, by the fact that there wasn't a vote in the Parliament the other day, we still have the two main political parties completely wedded to third country processing, to Nauru and to Malaysia, completely wedded to offshore processing in Christmas Island, completely wedded to mandatory detention. And our campaign is not going to be ended until we end those policies. So we do stand, I think, in a very bizarre way, because I think we've got a window of perhaps 18 months or 2 years to do something serious about turning that around. If Abbott, God forbid, if Abbott is elected at the next election, this is a man who will introduce legislation to allow him to send people to Nauru. He's committed to temporary protection visas. He's committed to turning the boats around. That is the legacy that we will inherit from what the Labor Party policies have been doing over the Malaysia agreement, and that's something which we have to be very determined, to stop. There is no time, I think, for complacency as far as the campaign is concerned. It is going to be up to us to continue that campaign. We still have something like 5,000 people in detention. 2,000 odd have been there longer than 12 months. 1,000 have been waiting for security clearances. 600 of them are stateless. How many hundreds of Iranians who they know they can't send back to the regime of Ahmadinejad, and they will still do nothing about releasing them into the community. And we've got a particular, people may see a little banner over there, we've got a particular group of Iranians who are in Camp Ashraf, stuck between Iraq and Iran. The UNHCR has declared them as refugees. The Australian government isn't willing to stand up for the people in Camp Ashraf when Iraq has tried to send them back to Iran. And why is that? Because the Australian government hasn't got the guts of its own commitment to actually say we can't send people back to Iran in Australia. They should be free and living in the community. So those things have got to change. We heard there's been a lot. I think some people have trying to jump to a premature conclusion. But out of the results of the discussion about the third country processing, and John referred to it a little. John Menadue referred to it a bit earlier. There have been some suggestions about bridging visas and community detention is going to be the way forward. Is going to be the de facto position of the Australian government. Now I would like to believe that was true, but actually there is nothing from what Chris Bowen has had to say that we should believe that is going to be true. I think what we are going to get is simply more of the same. When Bowen was cross-examined on Lateline, he actually said that the question of of community detention and bridging visas depended on the numbers, that there was nothing automatic about bridging visas for people living in the community. There is nothing that's been said which indicates that the next boatload of people that actually comes to Australia is going to be treated any differently from the last boatload, or the boatloads of people who came 2 years ago and are still waiting in detention for their claims to be actually processed. I tell you, there's one other thing which worries me enormously. because I have got absolutely no confidence that Chris Bowen or Julia Gillard is going to provide any kind of leadership or take responsibility for the people who are living in the community if they do get out. I'll tell you why. Because again, on Lateline, and it was excruciating to watch, but how many times did Tony Jones have to ask Chris Bowen about whether people who came here by boat were queue jumpers or not? And Chris Bowen could not bring himself to say that they are not queue jumpers. We know they're not queue jumpers. We know that myth is part of the way in which they sow deep seeds of resentment to refugees in the community, and we have got a Minister for Immigration who will not say that truth on public television, that they are not queue jumpers. How much confidence can we have that they are about to lead the debate that we need? I'll give you one other little example. Steve Price. I don't know how many people you know Steve Price. He's a shock jock, I think, in Melbourne. I've had the unfortunate experience of being on his radio programs from time to time. But Steve Price actually said to Chris Bowen yesterday morning, don't you think the Australian community is getting tired of this, I'm paraphrasing a little, don't you think getting tired of this debate, and don't you think there are actually increasing numbers of people in the Australian community who are happy to welcome people who arrive by boat? Now, what did Chris Bowen have to say to that? No. He said no. Steve Price asked him whether he thought the Australian community was willing to accept people who arrive by boat, and Chris Bowen said no. So committed is he to selling the rubbish of the Malaysia agreement. Now, this is again the immigration minister that we are going to expect for the next 2 years is going to carry the argument for welcoming refugees into the Australian community. Whatever else has gone place, I think Chris Bowen has shown that he's incapable of doing that. And similarly, I think when Julia Gillard recognised that the Malaysia agreement was off the cards, and she said there's going to be an increase in the number of boats. Now, we'll wait and see. I actually hope there is an increase in the number of boats. I hope more people can take the opportunity of fleeing the danger and coming to a place where perhaps they can get some kind of protection. Now, Julia Gillard said, I understand the concern in the Australian community about the boat arrivals. I don't understand that, and I don't understand how Julia Gillard again could take, when she had the opportunity in national television, to blow one of those other myths out of the water, that she did the same kind of dog whistle that when she was elected as Prime Minister last year. And that's Julia Gillard and Chris Bowen are the people who are going to be responsible for the more people in the community. I don't think we can rely on that. The risk is that we have got what we've seen in the last 2 days is going to continue for 18 months or 2 years. A continuation of the blame game, of Tony Abbott pointing to Julia Gillard and Julia Gillard talking to Tony Abbott about who's responsible for the boats' arrivals, and neither of them talking about why we need to welcome them in the community and why they should be welcome. So I just wanted to list a little bit about, we have got a huge amount of unfinished business to deal with. We may have temporarily put an end, or an impasse in Parliament has put an end to the third country processing. But offshore processing remains. It remains deeply flawed, it remains discriminatory, and it remains something that we need to get rid of. The Refugee Tribunal is not a wonderful institution by any means, but it is still much more responsible, much more open and more transparent than as far as offshore processing is concerned. Christmas Island must be closed. Offshore processing has to end. And I think the further thing is simply the issue of mandatory detention itself. Until mandatory detention is finished, then the issues that plague the self-harm, the attempted suicides, the lengthy detention, the things that are driving people mad inside the detention centres are going to continue. So I think we have to say very clearly, we do not want Nauru, not Malaysia, not offshore processing, and no to mandatory detention. And we have to, I think, say very, very clearly that there can be no compromise. A little bit is not good enough. It is no time to sit on our laurels, and we're going to have to continue to campaign. As someone said before, we're going to be outside the Labor Party conference on December the 4th. You can pick up leaflets and go away and build that protest, because we need to show Julia Gillard and Chris Bowen that, like always, and like over the last few years, that there is a campaign and there's a commitment and there is a movement which has been a bulwark against the racism and the xenophobia of our leaders, and that has been built from the grassroots up and can continue to build from the grassroots up. And with that kind of campaign, I think we can say very, very clearly that we can bring an end to the detention centres, that it still remains a job that we have, arm in arm with the people who arrived by boat seeking our protection, arm in arm with the protests that happen inside the detention centres and outside the detention centres. If it is up to us, we're going to tell Julie Gillard and Chris Bowen and Tony Abbott very, very clearly the fences and the fences around the detention centres will come down, mandatory detention will be ended, people will arrive by boat and will live in the community, be processed in the community, work in the community where they should be.